And I defy anyone to name 3 of the 10 provinces in Canada, any 3, that have done more on housing than the federal government has.
No one knows who the next Prime Minister is going to be. So as we enter this really crucial period, we're in what was quite frankly an avoidable circumstance and a position of weakness. Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Sabrina Maddeaux.
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
Today, we're going to look at Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's record when it comes to supporting the middle class, what he got right, and of course, what he got wrong.
Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Unless you've been vacationing on Mars, you've probably heard the news that Justin Trudeau has announced he will be stepping down as Prime Minister as soon as the Liberal Party has chosen his successor. In his resignation speech, he stated that since 2015, I've fought for this country, for you, to strengthen and grow the middle class. Well, since we're all about the middle class here at The Missing Middle, we thought it would be worthwhile to analyze the record of the Trudeau government when it comes to the middle class. And we're going to have some fun with it. Since I'm the failed liberal academic of the show, I'm going to highlight 3 issues where I believe that the Trudeau Liberals can claim some level of success. My co-host Sabrina, who the Toronto Star has described as a conservative pundit, will pick 3 issues where their performance has been, well, less than stellar. I'd like to pick the first issue, but in exchange, I'll let Sabrina pick the next 2. Then we can alternate till we get through all 6. Sabrina, are you ready to get started?
That works for me, Mike. Let's do it.
Okay, so my first one, and it's going to be a little bit controversial, a lot controversial, is housing supply policy. But hear me out here, folks. Let's look at it, that housing is in provincial jurisdiction. And I defy anyone to name 3 of the 10 provinces in Canada, any 3, that have done more on housing than the federal government has. I might give you British Columbia. After that, you're going to have problems. You look at it all together, that the CMHC, through their MLI Select program, which allows for apartment rental construction financing, has caused a rental construction boom in this country that we haven't seen in decades. We've seen the elimination of GST on purpose-built rental, reintroduction of accelerated capital cost allowance. We've seen a lot of really great tax reforms in order to get housing supply up. It's not all perfect. Some of their policies, like the housing accelerator, the implementation hasn't been great on. But I'd say overall, when you compare it to other governments within Canada, the federal government's actually looked pretty good on housing supply policy over the last few years.
I'm sorry, Mike, but I just can't give you this one. Ultimately, there's just far too little on the supply front, and it's far too late. And while they are certainly not perfect, they are way too far from it. Like you said, the Housing Accelerator Fund is full of loopholes, and there's seemingly little enforcement. Municipalities and provinces just have found other ways to block housing. And their national housing strategy was first launched in 2017. And since then, that only became more and more expensive with very few results to show. In fact, things are actually worse almost a decade later. And many units that were funded weren't generally affordable at all. Ultimately, you're right that the provinces bear a lot of responsibility for the housing supply crisis, but just because the provinces have failed so massively doesn't mean we should let the federal government off the hook. And I also think the federal government actually has a role in messaging that to the public so that they understand where to direct their ire at. And they just haven't really made that effort and been able to get that message across. The Trudeau government in general hasn't been good at that type of comms. And this is an area where it really mattered and they should have done better.
Yeah, so I'll actually agree with that the comms haven't been great. And I would have liked to see the federal government hit the provinces and municipalities harder. But in my mind, that's kind of admitting that the provinces and the municipalities are the problem, or at least a large part of the problem. So I actually don't think we're, totally as far off on that. So as promised, I'm going to give you the next 2. So what is your number 1 where you said, you know what, they've dropped the ball on this?
Now, when it comes to the Liberals' missteps, Immigration absolutely has to be at the top of the list. They set a target of bringing in 500,000 permanent residents per year by 2025. So, to put that into perspective, that's like adding a city the size of Halifax every single year. And here's where things got even more wild. They didn't just set high targets for permanent residents, they removed the caps on temporary foreign workers and international students. And at one point, they actually lost track of 1 million immigrants. So, despite warnings from experts and even their own public service, they pushed ahead. And the results were pretty disastrous for our middle class and for those looking to join it, including many immigrants themselves. Demand for housing and healthcare far exceeded supply, unemployment surged, and it's young workers that are getting hit the hardest. Youth unemployment is sitting at 14% right now, while wages are being pushed down, and the overall unemployment rate, a concerning 6.8%. We haven't seen labor force participation this low in over 27 years. So at the end of the day, you get a double whammy. Basic needs are more expensive and less accessible, while jobs and higher wages are harder to come by.
Yeah, this one's hard for me to argue that you're wrong. That yeah, I like the million immigrant thing. I mean, that's largely just a difference between what Statistics Canada estimates and what Benjamin Tal at CIBC estimates. But I do think it shows kind of a core problem that our population estimates. I don't think Tal is necessarily right, but I do think there are some issues when it comes to Statistics Canada, being able to do accurate population counts. But that's just that's nitpicky stuff. I think you're bang on in your general points that this was a huge problem for the federal government. The only thing I can really give them credit for is that when Mark Miller became minister, he's really done a lot to try and address this situation. But you have to admit, he's trying to address a problem that the government itself caused.
Yeah, and while they are starting to address it, I'd also argue it's far too little, too late, and they need to go even further. I'm going to turn the tables back to housing for my second point here, because housing isn't just about supply policy, it's also about demand. And the Liberals haven't just ignored the demand side, they've actively made it worse. And I'm talking about more than just immigration-driven demand. Their policies have consistently propped up housing prices rather than letting them become more affordable. They recently announced that first-time homebuyers can now take on 30-year mortgages. And maybe that sounds helpful, but here's the catch. It's like giving someone a longer rope to hang themselves with financially. Young Canadians end up taking on more debt for longer periods and paying significantly more in interest. So this is not a good deal. And there are other examples too. The first-time homebuyer savings account basically benefits only the highest earning young Canadians and functions just to set a new floor for entry-level home prices. And if we talk about their quote-unquote temporary foreign investment ban, that was written with so many gaping loopholes, it might as well not have even existed. Students, exempt. Recreational properties, exempt. And they weren't even checking where the money to buy homes is really coming from. They've also failed to address major issues like mortgage fraud or consider policies that could actually even the playing field without stimulating demand, like limiting the use of home equity lines of credit to fund down payments for second and third properties.
Yeah, so I think this might be the first one where I think there may be significant disagree, or at least some disagreement between us. I do think some of the savings accounts, were used to prop up demand, or basically just put additional fuel on the fire. I actually don't mind the 30-year mortgages. It doesn't make sense to me. Like if you have a 27-year-old home buyer, it doesn't make sense to me like why we're requiring them to pay off their home by the time they're 52. I've always thought that the home like should actually be proportional to their age, right? Like it doesn't make sense to me that a 67-year-old can get the same length of a mortgage as a 27-year-old. And I don't really see the need why the government should require a 27-year-old to pay their home off at 52. If they want to go longer, they should be able to. And that's actually where I come with a lot of this, that I actually prefer to see the government be more hands off on this stuff. So I'd actually criticize the government on some of this demand issue stuff, but actually come at it from the opposite angle. That I think that they're trying to reduce the demand side is actually, stomping on people's rights, right? Like I get the HELOC point, but if somebody wants to do that with a HELOC, like why not let them? I don't really see the need for the nanny state here. I think people should be able to invest their money how they want to, as long as it's not going to cause any kind of systemic risk. The foreign investment ban, I'm just in general not a fan of that one. Like the government, keeps trying to find scapegoats, whether it be foreign investors or, short-term rentals, that kind of thing. That's one where, again, let's just focus on building more homes, right? If homes are more plentiful, that stuff basically sorts itself out, right? Why we have so much speculative investment in housing is that we've made it a scarce asset. We basically turned it into Bitcoin, right? So let's solve the underlying problem. But the one I will totally agree with you here is the fraud piece. I do think the federal government should have done a lot more going back 9 years ago to do things like have CRA verification of income and that kind of thing. I think that has been a huge problem, and I think had the federal government cleaned up a lot of fraud in this area, that really would have driven a lot of the sort of bad actors out of the system and some of the bad money out of the system. So I'm half with you. You list a lot of things here, and like half of them, I'm like, yeah, those, that is a problem, the lack of CRA verification. But on the other half, again, I would kind of criticize the government the other way, or saying I would actually prefer them to be hands off and not be so micromanagey when it comes to sources of demand.
Well, it'd be a boring podcast if we agreed on everything. I do hear you about the 30-year mortgages and why not allow younger people more time to pay it off. I'd say, though, that right now is the wrong time when housing markets are at their peak and overinflated to introduce that measure. Maybe that could have been introduced a long time ago, or after we actually have the supply to bring houses down to a more affordable level. But I'll let you take the next point. What else went well, Mike?
I would say child benefit policies, and this is an older one. We're going back to the first 12 months of the government, but what essentially they did was take 4 different cash programs for kids that weren't particularly well targeted. The most famous one was where every parent got $100 a child, regardless of their income. And it was also, that money was also taxable. And I know people were getting dinged at tax time, where they were expecting to get a tax refund and they weren't, because they didn't realize that these benefit checks that they were getting for their kids were taxable. So those reforms to pool those together, target them more at the middle class, make them non-taxable, I think was a big deal. And again, you can argue, well, Mike, you're pointing at a policy from eight to 9 years ago. Okay, that's fine, but I still think it was an important achievement, both for the middle class and also for reducing child poverty.
This is the one where I'll mostly agree with you that the child benefit file was well handled and there have been improvements. That said, I'll have a couple points to pick. I'll say that they failed to tackle the most meaningful barriers to starting and raising a family, which is primarily housing these days. How can you afford to start a family when you're still stuck in a dog crate condo? Another issue for me is they really failed to update parental leave policies in line with current salaries, and also for non-full-time workers. I have a lot of friends who have had young children in the last few years, and I've actually only seen a few of them take their full mat leave because they simply can't afford to do that because these policies are so out of date. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement there, especially when you're talking about a self-proclaimed feminist government.
Yeah, I do think they could have done more on things like EI policies and parental leave. So you've done 2. Let's hear your third.
Absolutely. So, Mike, you've heard the joke. Canada is just 3 telecoms and a trench coat, or maybe it's 3 grocery stores. And well, that might seem funny. It's actually not, because our oligopoly problem is getting worse by the day. Remember that Roger Shaw merger? That went through. Air Canada buying Transat? Yep, that too. It's like we're watching monopoly pieces getting snatched up in real time, and the government just keeps watching it happen. Meanwhile, we're still protecting these industries like they're endangered species, keeping foreign competition out of telecoms and airlines, while supply management keeps our grocery prices sky high. And while the big players continue to get all of the perks, small businesses are drowning in red tape and taxes. The numbers are actually quite shocking. In 2000, 3 in 1,000 Canadians started a business. By 2022, that number was just 1.3. And even with a much larger population, thanks to all that immigration, we've got 100,000 fewer entrepreneurs than 20 years ago. And unlike the US, our entrepreneurship rates never recovered post-COVID. So the result here is that big corporations have gotten much bigger under the Liberals, while small players can't even get started, let alone compete. And for everyday Canadians, this means higher prices, fewer choices, lower wages, and a middle class that's getting hollowed out. You and Kara actually just had an episode featuring Denise Hearn and Vas Bednar that went into more depth about how market capture harms Canadians, and it was excellent. I highly recommend anyone who hasn't heard it yet go back and give it a listen, because even I learned a lot.
Okay, this is unfair because you just you picked one and that said, "Hey, your work on this is excellent." So how can I possibly disagree with that? Yeah, no, I largely agree. I would say that this one is more a mistake of inaction. That they largely left competition policy in place, the old rules in place, which allowed these mergers to go through. And yeah, it does feel like on many metrics, and I haven't read any studies on this recently. So if anyone has any, please send them our way. But it does feel like there is less competition in a number of sectors than there was a decade ago. Like I just look around my neighborhood, and all the places I could go buy my supply managed milk, they seem to be owned by fewer corporations. So you know what? Totally fair. Again, I feel like you butter me up a little bit by saying it was an excellent episode. So, who am I to argue? Last one, NAFTA 2.0. And this was more in the sense of averting a disaster. Like this could have been really bad for us when, the Trump administration comes in and wants to rip up NAFTA and basically onshore a lot of manufacturing back to the United States. I don't know what shore that is. Maybe the shores of Lake Erie, but basically bring that manufacturing back to the U.S. and get it out of southwestern Ontario. And being a southwestern Ontario guy, I can tell you what a massive concern that was. So I think the federal government did a great job along with provinces and business leaders and so on, where they worked the phones, they talked to U.S. governors, they tried to build a coalition of interest on the other side of the border, and not in a like, hey, we're friends, you got to help us out sense, but like, hey, if this stuff goes through, it's going to affect this plant in Flint, Michigan, or Cleveland, Ohio, or so on, because our supply chains are so multinational. There's the old statistics, and I've never really known if it's true or not, but the idea that a car manufactured in the Great Lakes region might cross the border 7 times before it's fully completed. So I think they did a great job there. Obviously, with the recent re-election, we're not out of the woods yet, but I do think 2.0 went a lot better than it could, or maybe frankly should have, for Canada.
I agree with you that the original negotiations and them being successful were incredibly important to us economically. My concern, which you touched on at the end, is where have they left us now as the Trump administration comes in for a second term? And obviously, Trump has been making threats of tariffs and threats of annexation towards Canada. Have they put us at such a disadvantaged position this time around that all of that's going to be for naught? On top of the fact that as Trump comes into office, we're in a situation where we really have a lame duck prime minister who's on his way out of office. We're in the middle of a leadership race. No one knows who the next prime minister is going to be. So as we enter this really crucial period, we're in what was quite frankly an avoidable circumstance and a position of weakness. But I guess we'll see what happens.
Yeah, you know, I can't disagree with that either, and it's really nice to see that a failed liberal academic and a conservative pundit could. I think we kind of 90% agreed on this. So yeah, there's it's a mixed record at best, and I agree with your last point. It's not over with this NAFTA renegotiation, and it looks like the new Prime Minister is not going to be in place until sometime in March. So we'll have to see what happens.
We'll certainly keep an eye on it. Well, thank you everyone so much for watching and listening, and to our producer, Meredith Martin.
And if you have any thoughts or questions about what the Trudeau government did to help the middle class or to harm it, please send us an email at missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.